Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Daphne's decision to hide from Carter the actuality of her hubby and children in Paris isn't simply a accessible cleaner twist but a psychologically thick, innocently fraught, and narratively strategic choice that exposes the core theme of love erected on falsehoods, a theme that has long driven romantic catastrophe in the world of BNB. Because Daphne isn't portrayed as a one-dimensional schemer but as a woman caught between inharmonious characters, each representing a different life path, value system, and emotional survival strategy, and her secretiveness can be read as the collision point between fear, desire, shame, and tone reinvention. At the most immediate position, Daphne hides her Paris family because she understands, maybe more easily than she admits indeed to herself, that Carter represents possibility rather than durability, a clean emotional slate rather than the complicated tally of choices she has formerly made, and in the heightened emotional sense of cleaner liar, possibility is intoxicating precisely because it demands the erasure of inconvenient trueness, so by forgetting her marriage and children, Daphne isn't simply lying to Carter but temporarily suspending the gravitational pull of her history so she can witness herself as the woman she might have been rather than the woman she is. Paris, in this sense, becomes further than a geographic position. It functions as a sealed emotional vessel where responsibility, routine, and compromise live, while Los Angeles and Carter emblematize threat, passion, and the vision of freedom, and Daphne's silence is the membrane that keeps these two worlds from polluting each other. Because formerly Carter knows the verity, the fantasy collapses, and Daphne is forced to integrate her individualities rather of codifying them. Psychologically, Daphne's just aligns with classic avoidance patterns, where an individual defying an internal conflict chooses concealment over battle, not out of malignancy but out of terror that honesty will lead to immediate loss, and Daphne likely believes that if Carter knows about her hubby and children, he'll see her not as a romantic equal but as a moral problem, a woman with baggage, divided commitment, and erected in limits, so the taradiddle becomes, in her mind, a form of tone protection, a way to delay rejection long enough to feel chosen, asked, and special. Indeed, if only temporarily, this is especially potent when considering Carter's own narrative function as a character who frequently represents emotional immutability, integrity, and the pledge of a healthy cooperation, because Daphne may intimately understand that Carter's values would force him to walk down the moment the verity shells, and therefore the taradiddle is lower about manipulating Carter into staying ever and further about stealing time to feel loved without conditions, time to imagine an alternate future, time to pretend that the life she erected in Paris wasn't formerly an unrestricted chapter written in endless essay. Thematically, the expression love erected on falsehoods is pivotal, because the show constantly interrogates whether love that begins in deception is ever real or simply performative, and Daphne's relationship with Carter becomes a case study in emotional armature erected on unstable ground, where every tender moment, every participated vulnerability, and every romantic pledge is intentionally resting on a fault line that will ultimately rupture, and the ineluctability of that rupture is what gives the plot its woeful instigation, because the followership is deposited not to ask if the verity will come out, but how ruinous the fallout will be when it does. From a moral viewpoint, Daphne's concealment is unpardonable yet deeply mortal, because while she deprives Carter of informed concurrence in the relationship, she also reveals how hopeless she's to be seen as further than a woman and mama, further than a set of scores defined by other people's requirements, and in cleaner pieces sense, that despair is frequently framed not as ill but as a precursor to tone destruction, suggesting that Daphne is unconsciously sabotaging herself by choosing short-term emotional delectation over long-term stability. The Paris family stunner, when it eventually detonates, is thus not just a plot twist designed to shock Carter but a narrative reckoning for Daphne, forcing her to defy the cost of fragmentation, because she cannot indefinitely be both the devoted mama in Paris and the unencumbered romantic maid in Los Angeles without someone getting hurt, and the show uses Carter's ineluctable sense of treason as a moral glass, reflecting back to Daphne the consequences of her choice to prioritize fantasy over verity. Importantly, Daphne's secretiveness also gates into the broader BNB tradition of women being penalized more roughly than men for romantic deception, and this plot invites observers to question whether Daphne is judged for lying or for daring to want commodity beyond the life she formerly has, because while her conduct are wrong, the emotional sense behind them is sorrowfully relatable. She's hysterical that her verity makes her unlovable in the environment she desires, so she edits herself into adequacy. Carter's part in this dynamic is inversely significant, because his trust is naive but principled, and when the stunner drops, his desolation is embedded not only in covetousness or moral outrage but in the consummation that the closeness he believed was collective was asymmetrical, that he was emotionally naked while Daphne remained armored, and this imbalance transforms love into violation. A crucial reason why love erected on falsehoods is so sharp it denies one mate the capability to choose freely. Narratively, Daphne's retired family functions as a delayed disclosure device that allows the pens to consolidate emotional stakes before pulling the hairpiece out, but it also reinforces the show's long-standing argument that secrets are no way neutral, that they laboriously shape connections indeed before they're revealed, because Daphne's jest toward Carter, her hesitance, her unforeseen recessions, her urgency, her guilt, are all informed by the taradiddle, meaning Carter is formally replying to a verity he doesn't know, making the relationship visited from its commencement. The stunner Jules Carter not simply because he learns Daphne is married with children, but because it retroactively venoms every memory he has of their connection, forcing him to reinterpret moments he allowed. Active collapse is frequently more ruinous than the original discovery itself. From Daphne's internal perspective, the reveal is inversely disastrous, because once the verity is out, she loses control of the narrative she constructed, and the identity she curated for Carter disintegrates, leaving her exposed as both a fabricator and a woman in pain. And B&B thrives in this space of emotional contradiction, where characters are contemporaneously reproachable and sympathetic. The Paris family stunner also raises questions about motherly identity and whether Daphne's concealment constitutes a rejection of her children or a compartmentalization born of overwhelm, because in Cleaner Liar, fatherhood is frequently idealized as all-consuming, and Daphne's desire to live outside of it's framed as transgressive, suggesting that part of her secretiveness stems from internalized guilt about wanting further than what society tells her should be enough. This internal conflict intensifies the tragedy, because Daphne isn't escaping her family out of abomination or neglect but out of a hankering for identity that she fears cannot attend with romantic desire in Carter's eyes. Structurally, the plot is designed to buckle rather than resolve fairly, because love erected on falsehoods infrequently transitions into love rebuilt on verity without significant immolation, and the followership is primed to anticipate that Daphne will pay for her deception through loss of Carter, loss of credibility, and potentially loss of her own tone image as a good person. Yet the emotional complexity of the situation also leaves room for interpretation, because while Carter is the wronged party, Daphne's taradiddle is a symptom rather than a cause, pointing to a deeper dissatisfaction and fear of invisibility that the show may or may not completely explore, depending on how willing it's to let womanish characters be messy without being irredeemable. Eventually, Daphne hid her hubby and children in Paris because telling the verity would have forced her to choose before she was ready, and the taradiddle allowed her to defer that reckoning. But in the moral macrocosm of B&B, laid-over reckonings always arrive with emulsion interest, and the desolation that follows is framed as both discipline and catharsis, stripping down vision so that whatever remains, whether separation, remission, or tone mindfulness, is at least real, and in that sense, the plot is lower about infidelity or deception in a non-fictional sense and further about the troubles of tone denial, because Daphne's topmost taradiddle isn't to Carter but to herself, the taradiddle that she could live two lives without either one demanding the verity, and the stunner that Jules Carter eventually explodes Daphne's precisely constructed emotional armature, leaving behind the central assignment the show returns to again and again: that love cannot survive as an escape door, that closeness demands wholeness, and that any love erected on elision is fated not just to fail but to wound everyone who believed in it. Continuing from this emotional and moral implosion, the fate of Daphne's Paris family stunner doesn't simply unfold as a direct fallout but rather as a prolonged cerebral reckoning that reverberates through every subcast of her connection with Carter Walton, because once the verity is exposed, the relationship no longer exists in the present tense but in fractions, before the taradiddle, during the taradiddle, and after the taradiddle, and none of those fractions can comfortably attend without inflicting pain. Carter's immediate response isn't just wrathfulness or heartache but disorientation, the kind that arises when a trusted emotional reality suddenly proves false, because he's forced to question his own judgment, his own instincts, and his own vulnerability, and this internal collapse is essential to understanding why Daphne's deception cuts so deeply, as it robs him not only of a romantic future but of confidence in the emotional knowledge he prides himself on, a ruinous blow for a character who frequently functions within the bold and the beautiful as a moral and emotional anchor. Carter's pain, thus, is unresistant or transitory but empirical, because he must attune the man he believed Daphne to be with the woman she actually is, and that conciliation is insolvable without admitting that closeness erected on partial trueness is closeness at each, but a performance in which only one mate knows the script. For Daphne, the exposure of her secret initiates a different kind of unraveling, one embedded less in shock and further in shame, because the fantasy she sustained through illusion defeats under the weight of responsibility, forcing her to defy the reality that she has come the mastermind of her own loss, and this tone recognition is arguably more cautioning than Carter's rejection, as it strips down her capability to frame herself as simply misnue or unlucky. The show uses this moment to emphasize a recreating verity about secretiveness, that falsehoods are infrequently insulated acts, but systems of jest that demand constant conservation, and once that system fails, everything it supported grottos in contemporaneously, leaving the fabricator exposed not just for what they hid, but for why they hid it. Daphne's reasons, while emotionally accessible, no longer serve as apologies in the fate, because the narrative shifts from provocation to consequence, and consequence is where the bold and the beautiful traditionally locates its moral weight. As the plot progresses, Daphne's Paris family transforms from a shocking disclosure into a creepy presence, because her hubby and children are no longer abstract obstacles but emotional realities that force Carter, and the followership, to rethink Daphne's choices not as romantic mistakes but as ethical failures with real mortal costs. The children, in particular, complicate any attempt to frame Daphne's conduct as a private matter between subscribing grown-ups, because their actuality introduces an implied moral contract that Daphne violated by emotionally lambing from her liabilities, indeed if only temporarily, and this element deepens the tragedy by sticking her taradiddle not just within the realm of love but within the broader environment of maternal obligation, yet the show resists turning Daphne into a villain outright, rather allowing her to articulate the suffocating pressures that drove her toward concealment, including the loss of identity that frequently accompanies fatherhood in cleaner narratives, the invisibility that creeps in when one's value becomes tethered simply to caregiving, and the hopeless craving to be asked as a woman rather than depended upon as a part. This architecture doesn't vindicate Daphne but humanizes her, inviting observers to scuffle with the uncomfortable verity that moral failure frequently emerges not from atrocity but from prostration, fear, and the hunger for recognition. Carter's turndown, or incapability, to incontinently forgive Daphne becomes a critical narrative station, because it affirms that love does end obligate forbearance of deception, no matter how sympathetic its origins, and this is where the show reinforces one of its most harmonious assignments, that emotional translucency isn't voluntary in adult connections, but foundational. Carter's boundaries, rather than being portrayed as corrective, are depicted as necessary acts of tone respect, and this distinction matters, because it reframes his pullout not as abandonment but as preservation, a reclaiming of agency that Daphne denied him through her silence. The heartache, thus, is collective but asymmetrical, because while both characters suffer, only one was deprived of the capability to choose their suffering deliberately, and the narrative constantly returns to this imbalance to justify Carter's pain as qualitatively different from Daphne's remorse. In this way, the plot resists the temptation to glamorize remission precociously, rather allowing the rupture to stand as a meaningful consequence rather than a temporary handicap to reunion. As the emotional dust settles, Daphne is left defying an identity extremity that extends beyond her relationship with Carter, because the collapse of the taradiddle forces her to reckon with the uncomfortable possibility that the life she fled in Paris isn't the adversary she imagined, but the reality she refused to integrate into her sense of tone. The show subtly suggests that Daphne's topmost failure wasn't loving Carter or indeed lying to him, but believing that her history disqualified her from being loved actually in the present, a belief that eventually came tone-fulfilling. This internalized unworthiness is what made deception feel safer than verity, because verity carried the threat of rejection, and Daphne chose certainty over vulnerability, indeed when that certainty guaranteed eventual destruction. the tragedy lies in the fact that had she told the verity before, she might still have lost Carter, but she'd have saved her integrity, and integrity, formerly lost, is far harder to reclaim than love. The love erected on falsehood's frame reaches its thematic climax then, as the show interrogates whether love that begins as an escape can ever evolve into commodity sustaining, or whether escape is, by description, inharmonious with closeness. Daphne's affair with Carter, emotional or else, is revealed to be lower about love than about retreat, a temporary sanctum from the demands and bummers of her real life, and the exposure of her Paris family strips that sanctum of its vision, revealing it as a fragile structure erected to collapse the moment reality intruded. Carter's desolation, also, isn't simply the pain of being deceived but the pain of realizing that he was no way Daphne's destination, only her diversion, and this consummation is maybe the most irrecoverable crack of all, because it reframes the relationship not as a participated trip but as a unilateral escape route. In the broader environment of The Bold and the Beautiful, Daphne's plot reinforces the show's long-standing dubitation toward compartmented lives, especially when those chambers are divided along moral lines, and her fall from romantic grace echoes a numerous forerunners who believed they could overrun verity through elision, only to discover that verity is patient, inexorable, and devastatingly thorough. Yet the show also leaves open the possibility of growth, not inescapably through romantic conciliation but through tone mindfulness, suggesting that Daphne's discipline isn't eternal exile from love but the loss of vision, a painful but necessary step toward wholeness. Whether the narrative eventually redeems her or leaves her insulated, the assignment remains complete that love demands courage, that honesty is an act of respect rather than concession, and that the cost of lying is infrequently paid only by the fabricator. Eventually, the durability of this plot deepens its original thesis rather than resolving it neatly, showing that the real damage of Daphne's deception isn't confined to a single net reveal but ripples outward, altering individualities, reshaping futures, and leaving emotional scars that cannot be undone by reason alone. Carter emerges changed, more guarded but also more tone-apprehensive, while Daphne is left standing amid the remains of a life she tried to divide rather than defy. And the show's enduring communication crystallizes with brutal clarity that love erected on falsehoods doesn't simply collapse, it educates, injuries, and transforms, forcing every character involved to define not just what they lost, but who they were when they chose to lie, and who they must become if they ever hope to love again without hiding. In the final phase of this bow, the emotional residue of Daphne's deception lingers not as psychodrama but as a quiet, sharp pang that reshapes how both characters understand closeness, trust, and identity, because the true consequence of the Paris family disclosure isn't the explosive battle itself but the silence that follows, the absence where connection formerly lived, and this is where the plot becomes most ruinous, as Carter Walton is forced to accept that some backstabbings do end with crying or gashes but with an endless recalibration of what feels safe. Carter's emotional pullout is portrayed less as discipline and further as grief operation, because to remain open after such a profound deception would bear a position of emotional amnesia he simply doesn't retain, and the show allows this restraint to stand as a form of maturity rather than dispassionateness, buttressing the idea that remission isn't synonymous with conciliation, especially when trust has been structurally undermined rather than shortly shaken. For Daphne, the long tail of her taradiddle manifests as insulation rather than combination, because once the fantasy collapses, she's left alone with the unornamented verity of her life choices, and the show resists offering her an easy emotional cover or immediate redemption bow, rather forcing her to sit with the discomfort of having been completely seen and set up wanting. This narrative tolerance is significant, because it reframes suffering not as spectacle but as consequence, suggesting that growth, if it comes, must be earned through soul-searching rather than romantic forgiveness. Daphne's grief is concentrated, encompassing the loss of Carter, the shattering of her tone conception as an unnaturally honest person, and the sobering consummation that the life she tried to escape still awaits her, unchanged and undetermined, in Paris. And this confluence of losses strips down any remaining visions that secretiveness was ever a feasible survival strategy. Within the moral ecosystem of The Bold and the Beautiful, this plot eventually functions as an exemplary contemplation on the troubles of emotional compartmentalization, particularly for characters who believe reinvention requires erasure, because Daphne's tragedy isn't that she loved two lives but that she refused to attune them. Choosing fragmentation over integration until the fracture came unrecoverable, the show's turndown to incontinently reunite her with Carter underscores its broader thematic station that love cannot be sustained as an act of defiance against reality, and that connections embedded in avoidance inescapably collapse under the weight of verity, no matter how sincere the passions involved. What remains after the fallout isn't resolution but clarity, and that clarity is painful for both parties, because Carter must accept that love doesn't guarantee safety, and Daphne must accept that desire doesn't excuse deceitfulness, and in this collective reckoning, the plot achieves its most continuing impact, transubstantiating a sensational stunner into a continuing character study. The final assignment, delivered without saccharinity, is that closeness demands courage long before it demands passion, and that the cost of lying isn't simply losing someone differently but losing the interpretation of oneself who believed love could live without verity, a loss that lingers far longer than heartache and serves as the quiet, implacable fate of a love that was no way allowed to be whole.